The UFC is the place where the best fight the best, and where we see dreams come true and champions made. The UFC has built a model which now runs like a well-oiled machine, with just over 40 fight cards a year, with around 13 pay-per-views. These pay-per-views are usually headlined by the biggest and baddest world title fights, but sometimes some fights get the rare distinction to headline these major pay-per-views without a world title on the line. Whether due to a major superstar, a huge rivalry, or the original main event falling through, we end up getting some spectacular matchups without some gold on the line headlining some legendary pay-per-views. So let's look into them. This is the Fight franchise and the top 10 non-title fight UFC pay-per-view main events. Number 10. Nate Diaz vs Tony Ferguson. One of the recent pay-per-views which was headlined by a non-title fight, UFC 279, would be originally scheduled to be headlined by the legendary and infamous Nate Diaz, and one of the most scariest and entertaining fighters the UFC had in recent years, Khamzat Chimaev. This looked like a fight which the UFC wanted to bury Nate Diaz on his exit from the company, while helping build Chimaev's stock. The fight felt like a lamb to slaughter, which was when the MMA gods spared Nate Diaz, as Khamzat Chimaev missed weight, which caused a reshuffle of the card, with Tony Ferguson, who made 170 pounds, being bumped up into the main event. The two fought in a fun fight, which did feel like a fight which should have happened 5 years ago, but to see two massive superstars of the UFC go blow for blow in the octagon was super cool. For Diaz to end his career on a win and seeing a legend of MMA dodge what was his impending doom, which was Khamzat Chimaev, was awesome. And for Diaz to secure the submission with 2 minutes 9 seconds left in the round, what a send-off. Number 9. Anderson Silva vs Israel Adesanya. The two greatest middleweights in UFC history squared off in a legendary matchup, one of the like I doubt MMA fans will ever see again. While Israel Adesanya was on his rise in MMA, he would be paired up against his idol Anderson Silva in the co-main event of UFC 234, with Robert Whittaker headlining against Kelvin Gastelum. Whittaker right before the event would have to pull out due to a hernia, which meant Silva and Adesanya would be bumped up to the main event. The fight would be a masterpiece of striking, one the likes we had never seen before in MMA. In a fight which more looked like a dance, both men went strike for strike in a legendary bout, which felt like the passing of the torch in the middleweight division. Adesanya would win the decision victory in one of the most fun MMA fights of all time. The fight was huge, and we can only imagine what it would have been like with both guys in their prime. Nonetheless, this is one of the greatest MMA pay-per-view main events of all time, and definitely didn't need a world title on the line. Number 8. Anderson Silva vs Nick Diaz. These two guys are MMA royalty, two completely different characters from two different parts of the world, but UFC 183 would be the backdrop for this legendary showdown. Anderson Silva would lose his world title to Chris Weidman in one of the biggest MMA upsets of all time at UFC 162. At UFC 168, the Spider got his rematch and his opportunity at revenge at Chris Weidman. Silva would be bested by Weidman in the first round and all the way up to the second round, where he threw a leg kick checked by Weidman, which snapped Silva's shin in half. This was horrifying. One of the greatest MMA fighters we had ever seen was brutally injured in the octagon, and we never knew if we would see him again. Nick Diaz, however, would join the UFC from Strikeforce and beat BJ Penn, but lose to Carlos Condit and lose to GSP for the welterweight title. Diaz would take a break from the sport and sat on the sideline, waiting for a big fight. Anderson Silva's anticipated return after his horrific injury would be the fight Diaz would return for. Both men would square off in what felt like a mega fight between two legends of the MMA game. The hype would be huge, with some amazing promos beforehand. The fight would be a 5-round battle fought on the feet, with Diaz pressing forward but Silva being too slick with his striking, catching out Diaz on multiple occasions. The fight featured some now legendary moments, with Nick Diaz taunting Anderson. Anderson would win the decision victory, and seeing him cry in the octagon after was an iconic moment. Yes, the fight wasn't a barn burner, but seeing two legends of the MMA game square off in an infamous pay-per-view main event with all the hype beforehand deserves it a spot on the list. Number 7. Conor McGregor vs Dustin Porier 2. MMA's biggest star of all time definitely doesn't need a belt on the line to headline a pay-per-view. Conor McGregor, ever since he lost to Khabib for the world title, has fought in 3 main events at UFC 246, UFC 257 and UFC 264. Though all these events are honestly worthy of making this list, we are focusing on his fight at UFC 257 against Dustin Porier. Conor would nearly miss all of 2020 fighting at the start of the year versus Cerrone, but would be on the sideline due to the pandemic. UFC put on a huge event on Fight Island, with the Notorious facing Dustin Porier in a rematch of their bout from UFC 178, where McGregor destroyed Porier in less than 1 round. Conor would be subdued, with no trash talk coming into the bout and full of respect. The fight took place with McGregor trying to use his superior striking and boxing against Dustin, while Dustin would focus on attacking McGregor's leg with calf kicks. The fight went into the second round with McGregor noticeably struggling with the calf kicks, which is when Porier with his striking found an opening and would back McGregor against the fence. and knock him out. This was unbelievable. Yes, we had seen McGregor lose before, but that was via submission. But to see McGregor, an elite striker, KO'd was mind-blowing, and truly an iconic and legendary moment in MMA history. For this main event to give us a moment so massive like that, of course this fight makes the list. Number 6. Mirko Cro Cop vs GABRIEL Gonzaga. If you ever get the time to go through a list of the greatest UFC KOs of all time, and in fact MMA KOs of all time, you'll find this fight on nearly all those lists. But what many fans don't know, this fight was the main event of UFC 70. The UFC in 2006 managed to acquire one of the most legendary and best fighters in Pride history, Mirko Cro Cop. Cro Cop was known for some legendary bouts and fights in Pride, and would be well known for his kicks, where he would earn the moniker and phrase, Right Kick Hospital and Left Kick Cemetery. Cro Cop entered the UFC as the Pride Openweight World Champion and would win his first fight at UFC 67 via stoppage, which is where the UFC decided to put him in a title eliminator versus GABRIEL Gonzaga, which headlined UFC 70 in Manchester, England. The fight would be one round, with Cro Cop throwing a kick to the body early, with Gonzaga catching the kick and taking down and smothering Cro Cop. Herb Dean didn't see enough action and stood them back up. However, seconds after standing them up, Gonzaga threw a huge right kick to flatline Cro Cop and leave him out cold in the octagon. Gonzaga finished the legendary Mirko Cro Cop with his own move, with one of the most shocking moments and KOs in UFC history. Let's just say the fans in Manchester, England at UFC 70 witnessed a piece of MMA history, and the UFC didn't even need to put on a title fight in the main event. Number 5. Brock Lesnar vs Alistair Overeem. When you make a list of the biggest stars in MMA and UFC history, Brock Lesnar most certainly makes that list. Brock definitely can headline a UFC event without a title on the line, and it would be a massive spectacle. Case in point, UFC 141. Brock Lesnar, after his title loss to Cain Velasquez, would take a break from the sport due to suffering from diverticulitis, and Dana White stated Brock needed to have 12 inches removed from his colon. Alistair Overeem was making waves in Strikeforce in their heavyweight Grand Prix, but would be pinched by Dana and the UFC as Brock's return fight after a year out of the sport. The two Goliaths went head to head in the main event at UFC 141. With over 750,000 pay-per-view sold, fans tuned in for this massive spectacle, where the game plan for Brock was to use his superior wrestling to smother and smash Overeem, and Overeem wanted to use his superior kickboxing to smash and KO Brock Lesnar, which is what happened. Overeem pressured Brock and landed huge knees to the body of Lesnar, which he had just had surgery on. Overeem would land another huge knee and kick to the body, which folded Brock Lesnar against the fence, with Overeem finishing him with strikes. To see two Goliath heavyweights in the octagon go head to head was unreal. For it to give us such a legendary stoppage finish was a huge moment in MMA history. Honestly, Brock Lesnar could come back today and main event a pay-per-view without a title. He is a true megastar. For UFC to give us such a legendary main event which is replayed all the time, it is easily one of the best pay-per-view main events ever, and it didn't even need a title on the line. Number 4. Chuck Liddell vs Rashad Evans. One of the biggest superstars, if not the biggest superstar in early MMA history, Chuck Liddell was box office and known all around the world, and was famously known as the UFC and MMA's biggest star. He would, with his amazing fight style and signature look, help bring in a whole legion of fans into the sport. Chuck Liddell's best years would be when he went on his legendary heavyweight title streak, and once that came to an end, he would slowly fall out the title picture, but would still be a massive name. Liddell would lose his title in a legendary KO loss to Rampage Jackson and lose his next fight to Keith Jardine, but would bounce back in the co-main event of UFC 79 in what was a legendary war and fight of the year versus Wanderlei Silva. He would earn the decision victory in an epic battle versus the Brazilian, and would be in his next fight paired with a hot prospect and undefeated Rashad Evans. The two headlined at UFC 88 in a bout which would see if Liddell still had it to be a champion again and if Evans was the real deal. The two would have a tentative first round, with neither man landing anything significant. The second round, however, Liddell would begin to pressure Rashad and have him backed up against the cage, but couldn't find that KO shot. With just over 3 minutes left in the round, Liddell pressured Evans against the cage, where Evans threw a vicious right hand to leave Liddell lifeless in the octagon. This was spectacular. Evans just had the biggest win of his career, knocking out cold one of the biggest stars in MMA history. Yes, we had seen Liddell knocked out before, but that definitive was unbelievable viewing. Yes, the overall fight wasn't the best, but to finish like that was mind-blowing, and another reason why the UFC should give us more legendary non-title fights to headline main event pay-per-views. Number 3. Conor McGregor vs Nate Diaz 1. Of course you knew this one would make the list, and honestly, if you debated it as number 1 on the list, I wouldn't argue it with you. When Conor McGregor joined the UFC, he would slowly become a global superstar and must-watch TV. With his witty personality, amazing fight style, he was truly box office, going on a legendary streak in the featherweight division, capturing gold, beating at the time the arguable best pound-for-pound fighter in the world, Jose Aldo. McGregor beat him in a way we had never seen in MMA. knocking out the Brazilian icon in 13 seconds. With McGregor's stock at an all-time high, the UFC booked him for a quick turnaround at UFC 196, where he would try to replicate the history he achieved in Cage Warriors and become a double champion. He would be scheduled to fight Rafael Adesanya, who would pull out due to a broken foot. Dana White and the UFC didn't want their cash cow not fighting while he was healthy, and pitched many names but would eventually come to terms with Nate Diaz, the winner of TUF Season 5 and the younger brother to Nick Diaz. The trash talk beforehand would be legendary and help build the fight. The fight would be at welterweight, and with Conor on a legendary streak and with all the fans behind him, no one could believe anything but a Conor win. Conor would start the first round brilliantly, throwing huge shots, cutting up Diaz, while Nate would slowly grow into the round as it went on. The second round would be one of the most famous and legendary second rounds in MMA history. We would see McGregor landing strikes and busting up Nate, but Diaz, like a zombie, wasn't going anywhere, which sapped the gas tank of McGregor, which was when Nate started to have success on the feet. A tired McGregor would shoot on Nate Diaz, which was when Nate used his legendary Caesar Gracie Jiu-Jitsu and got the back and finished the biggest superstar in MMA history for the first time since 2010 in Cage Warriors. The MMA world went into pandemonium. Diaz was an overnight phenomenon and gave us one of MMA's greatest ever fights and moments. All this and we didn't even have a world title on the line. What a pay-per-view main event. Number 2. Conor McGregor vs Nate Diaz 2. Oh yes, the follow-up of the previous entry. With MMA's biggest superstar getting his first humbling in the UFC, you just knew he had to get revenge. And this is what this fight was all about. With both guys now huge global names, this fight was even bigger than before. With the trash talk and bad blood even more heated, Conor would rematch Nate Diaz at UFC 202 in a now legendary matchup. Though McGregor was featherweight champion, this was about avenging his one loss in the UFC, and both men headlined in a now legendary main event and pay-per-view. The trash talk and bad blood would be even higher, with the two men seriously disliking each other. The two men fought in one of the best fights of the year, with massive stakes and implications on McGregor's career. Both men went strike for strike in the octagon, with McGregor possessing more power, being more crisp, dropping Nate on multiple occasions. Nate would grow into the fight and have his own success in the striking, landing some brilliant shots himself. Diaz would stalk a tired McGregor and try to finish him again, but Conor managed to weather the Diaz storm. The fight went all 5 rounds after both men fought in a now iconic war, with McGregor getting his hand raised to the dismay of Diaz. Nonetheless, this was one of the most iconic, fun and legendary main events in UFC pay-per-view history, and no belt was needed, just a good old-fashioned grudge match. I know the UFC are doing it with the rematch of Porier and Gaethje, but sometimes pay-per-view main events we don't always need title fights. Sometimes a brilliant rivalry can just do the trick. Number 1. Dan Henderson vs Shogun Rua. Yes, that's right. What is considered by some MMA fans as the greatest MMA fight of all time was a non-title fight which was headlined at UFC 139. In a now legendary matchup, Dan Henderson took on the iconic Shogun Rua. Both men went to war throughout the 5-round fight, with instant action in the first minute, with Henderson busting up and almost stopping Shogun. Then towards the end of the first round, Shogun would clip Henderson behind the ear and try to secure the finish himself. This rollercoaster of a fight continued, with Henderson almost KOing and finishing Shogun in the 3rd round, only for Shogun to survive and almost secure a heel hook against Henderson himself. Henderson would get revenge in the 4th, getting Shogun's back and almost securing a choke, only for Shogun to scramble out of it and try and secure another heel hook. With Henderson tired, Shogun began to take over the fight at the end of the 4th round and secured an amazing trip, with Shogun mounting Henderson and trying to finish him, but Henderson survived, reversed the position and finished the round on top. The final round, Shogun dominated a tired Henderson, with Henderson holding on for dear life, trying to not get finished. This fight went to the judges' scorecard, with Henderson getting the nod. This was a true war and one of the greatest MMA fights ever, which is now in the UFC Hall of Fame. There was no real bad blood, no title on the line. This was just two high-level contenders going at it, who ended up putting on a huge war. This fight was amazing matchmaking by the UFC, who deserve huge credit, and should be a lesson what pay-per-views can be at times, when sometimes a title fight isn't there to headline. Sometimes we get some magic, like we did at UFC 139. Did you enjoy the video? Let us know down in the comments below. What do you think is the best pay-per-view main event which didn't have a title fight? Put it down in the comments below. And what fight would you like to see main event a pay-per-view without a title fight? Put that down in the comments below. Leave a like if you've enjoyed the video and subscribe for more MMA and fight content coming soon. We hope you enjoyed the video and we'll catch you in the next one.